6 weeks after Princess Diana's death, Queen Elizabeth sat in the royal box at Wembley Arena, frozen by grief she couldn't show. Then Prince saw something in her eyes. He stopped his concert, changed the set list, and sang a song that made a nation weep. October 1997. First public appearance since Diana's funeral. 20,000 people watching. TV cameras rolling. And the moment when Britain's most guarded woman finally broke. Wembley Arena was packed with 20,000 people who'd come to see Prince perform for a royal charity event. The atmosphere was electric, but strange, celebratory, but cautious. Everyone knew what had happened 6 weeks ago. Everyone knew who was sitting in the royal box. The purple lights swept across the massive crowd. Prince's band was on fire. Let's Go Crazy had opened the show with explosive energy. Kiss had the audience dancing in the aisles. 1,999 turned Wembley into a massive party. This was Prince at his peak, 39 years old, touring the world, commanding stages like a musical god. But something was different tonight. The royal box loomed over stage left, draped in crimson velvet and gold trim. Inside sat Queen Elizabeth II, surrounded by advisors, security, and the weight of 70 years wearing a crown. She sat perfectly still, back straight, hands folded, face expressionless. The same face she'd worn through World War II, through scandals, through the collapse of the British Empire. The face of a monarch who'd been trained since childhood that emotion was weakness. But inside, she was breaking. The 31st of August 1997, Princess Diana died in a Paris car crash. The world stopped. Britain wept. Millions of flowers piled outside Kensington Palace. So many that the gates disappeared beneath bouquets and teddy bears, and handwritten notes from strangers who felt like they'd lost a friend. But the royal family stayed silent. No public statement for 5 days. No tears. No acknowledgement of the grief consuming the nation. They remained at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, following protocol that said the family grieved in private, always in private. The British press turned savage. "Show us you care!" screamed the headlines. "Where is the Queen?" demanded the tabloids. "Your people are crying, why aren't you?" For the first time in her 45-year reign, Elizabeth faced genuine anger from her own people. The crowds outside Buckingham Palace weren't cheering. They were questioning. She'd finally returned to London after 5 days of pressure from Prime Minister Tony Blair. The walk past the flowers at Diana's palace, her face carefully composed, not a tear. The televised address to the nation, her voice steady, measured, controlled. The funeral walking behind the coffin with perfect royal posture, while millions watched and judged. Not a single tear, not a crack in the facade. The world called her cold, heartless, out of touch. But it had cost her everything. The guilt over Diana, their complicated relationship, the divorce she'd approved, the distance she'd maintained. Too late now to say the things that needed saying. Too late to bridge the gap. Too late for anything except regret. And even that she wasn't allowed to show. Now, 40 days later, this was her first public appearance. A charity concert for underprivileged children, one of Diana's causes. Required by protocol, expected by duty. The palace had debated for weeks whether she should attend. Too soon? Not soon enough? Would her presence help or hurt? She'd come because the crown required it, because duty always came first. But she'd left her heart somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, buried under layers of grief she wasn't allowed to express, suffocating under the weight of a crown that demanded strength over humanity. Prince's tour manager had briefed him extensively before the show. Her Majesty will be present. Standard protocol. No direct interaction during performance. You acknowledge her presence at the start with a bow. She'll leave after 60 minutes. Exactly. Don't deviate from the approved set list. Don't address her directly. Just perform. But Prince had seen the news coverage over the past 6 weeks. He'd watched the funeral broadcast. He'd seen something in the Queen's eyes during that long walk behind Diana's coffin, something the cameras caught in unguarded moments. Not coldness, not indifference, pain so deep it had nowhere to go except inward, turning toxic because it couldn't be released. On stage now, performing the sixth song of the evening, Prince glanced up at the royal box during a guitar solo. Protocol said, "You didn't make eye contact with royalty during performance. You acknowledged their presence at the beginning and end, nothing more." But Prince had never been good at following protocol. He was halfway through Purple Rain when it happened. The crowd was singing along, lighters held high, that communal moment of connection that made live music sacred. Prince's guitar wept through the arena, bending notes that carried the weight of human emotion. And then he looked up. Really? Looked, not at the royal box as a ceremonial requirement, but at the woman sitting inside it. Queen Elizabeth II met his eyes. For 3 seconds, they held contact. 3 seconds that somehow contained an entire conversation without words. Prince saw what no one else could see from that distance. From that angle, her eyes were wet. Not crying, she would never allow herself to cry, but on the edge, teetering. A woman who'd spent 70 years building walls around her heart, and those walls were cracking. The grief she couldn't show, the love she'd never been allowed to express, the guilt over. Diana too late now, always too late. The exhaustion of being a symbol instead of a human being. All of it, visible for just 3 seconds in the eyes of Britain's most guarded woman. Prince's fingers stopped moving on the guitar. The band, confused, gradually fell silent. Purple Rain died. Mid-chorus, 20,000 people held their breath, uncertain what was happening. What Prince did next broke every rule of royal protocol and created the most intimate moment in British royal history. Prince turned to his band. "Change of plans," he said quietly, but his microphone picked it up and sent it through Wembley Arena. The crowd murmured. This wasn't how concerts worked. You didn't stop Purple Rain mid-song. You didn't change the setlist in real time. Prince's musical director looked panicked. "What do you want?" "Sometimes it snows in April," Prince said. "Piano version." "Just me." The musical director's eyes went wide. That song wasn't on tonight's set list. That song was never performed at charity events. Too sad, too intimate, too raw. But Prince was already walking to the piano at stage right. The crowd fell silent, sensing something unprecedented was happening. In the royal box, Queen Elizabeth's advisors exchanged concerned glances. This wasn't in the program. What was the American doing? Prince sat at the white grand piano. He adjusted the microphone, and then he did something that made every royal protocol officer in the building have a small heart. Attack. He looked directly at the royal box and spoke. "Your Majesty." His voice carried through the arena, gentle but clear, not his usual playful prince persona. Something more serious, more human. The formality of those 2 words made 20,000 people realize he was breaking protocol. He was addressing the Queen directly. Artists didn't do that. Not during performance. Not without permission. Queen Elizabeth didn't move, but she was listening. "This song isn't on tonight's list," Prince continued, "but I feel it needs to be sung for someone who's carried the weight of a nation on her shoulders and forgotten she's allowed to feel." The silence in Wembley Arena was absolute. You could hear people breathing. In living rooms across Britain, millions watched on BBC, frozen. Have you ever watched someone carry grief so heavy it was destroying them? Have you ever wanted to tell, "It's okay to break"? Prince was about to do exactly that, in front of 20,000 witnesses and an entire nation. Prince's fingers touched the piano keys. The opening notes of "Sometimes It Snows in April" floated through Wembley Arena like a prayer. This wasn't a pop song. This was a meditation. On loss. On mortality. On the cruel unfairness of death taking people before we're ready to let them go. Prince had written it about a friend who died too young. But tonight, it became something else entirely. His voice, usually so powerful and commanding, was soft now, almost fragile, singing about Tracy dying too fast, about April snow that shouldn't exist, about grief that arrives unexpected and unwelcome. In the royal box, Queen Elizabeth's carefully maintained composure began to crack. She'd held it together for 6 weeks. through the shock of that midnight phone call, through the diplomatic meetings and funeral arrangements, through the walk behind the coffin while millions watched, through the speeches and ceremonies and endless condolences. But she'd never had permission to grieve. Not really. Not in the way humans needed to grieve. And now this man, this American pop star she'd never met, was singing directly to that pain, acknowledging it, giving it space to exist. The first tear formed in the corner of her right eye. For 7 decades, she'd been trained to prevent exactly this moment. Crying was weakness. Emotion was failure. The crown must never show. Vulnerability. But the tear didn't care about protocol. It fell. Prince continued playing, his voice carrying every word with devastating gentleness. The song built slowly, each verse pulling deeper into the heart of grief. 20,000 people in Wembley Arena weren't just watching anymore. They were witnessing something sacred, a private moment happening in the most public way possible. The BBC cameras, which had been doing standard concert coverage, slowly zoomed in on the royal box. The director knew instinctively. This was history. The footage would matter. Queen Elizabeth's II tear fell. Then a third. Her hands, which had been folded perfectly in her lap, trembled slightly. Her advisors beside her froze, unsure whether to intervene, unsure if intervention would make everything worse. In the audience, people began to realize what was happening. Word spread, row by row. The Queen is crying. Look at the royal box. She's actually crying. Some people started crying themselves. Not from Prince's song, from watching Britain's most stoic figure finally, allow herself to feel. But Prince wasn't finished. What he did after the song ended would create a moment that Britain would remember for decades. When the final note faded, silence held for 5 full seconds. Then applause began, not the usual concert roar, but something more reverent, respectful, grateful. Prince stood from the piano. He looked at the royal box again. Queen Elizabeth was wiping her eyes with a handkerchief, trying to compose herself, trying to rebuild the walls that had just crumbled. And then Prince did something that made every royal protocol officer in the building reach for their phones. He walked off stage, directly toward the royal box entrance. His tour manager grabbed his arm. "You can't. I'm not asking permission," Prince said quietly. Protocol dictated that artists never approach the royal box uninvited. Protocol dictated that the Queen left first, always, and you waited until she was gone before moving. Protocol dictated everything about how one interacted with monarchy. Prince had never cared much for protocol. Royal security met him at the entrance to the private box corridor. "Sir, you can't." A voice from inside the box. "Let him through." Queen Elizabeth's voice. Quiet, but firm. Prince entered the royal box. It was smaller than it looked from outside plush velvet seats. A small table with refreshments. And Her Majesty the Queen, standing now, her eyes still wet. Her composure returning, but not quite there yet. "Your Majesty," Prince said. And this time he bowed, not the elaborate theatrical bows he did on stage, but a genuine, respectful acknowledgement. That was. Elizabeth paused, searching for words. She who gave speeches to Parliament, who negotiated with prime ministers, who'd addressed the nation countless times, couldn't find the right words. That was very kind. "Music knows things before we do, ma'am," Prince said gently. "It tells us what we need to hear, even when we don't want to listen." The Queen looked at him, really looked at him, not as a subject, not as an entertainer, as one human being to another. "I've spent 70 years learning not to feel in public," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight you gave me permission to remember I'm human." Prince reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a purple silk handkerchief, hand-stitched, elegant. He offered it to her. "For the next time you need to cry," he said. "Purple is the color of royalty, but it's also the color of humanity. You're allowed to be both." Queen Elizabeth took the handkerchief, her fingers closing around it like it was something precious. "How did you know," she asked, "that I needed this?" "Because grief doesn't respect rank, ma'am, and neither does music." At that moment, Elton John appeared in the doorway. He'd been backstage, preparing for his own performance later in the evening. He'd watched everything on the backstage monitors. Now he stood frozen, witnessing something he'd never imagined. In 40 years, Elton would say later, I've performed for Her Majesty 17 times. I've never seen her cry. Prince did it in 4 minutes. Queen Elizabeth looked at the purple handkerchief in her hands, then at Prince, then at the doorway where her advisors waited, uncertainty written across their faces. Thank you, she said to Prince. You've given me something I didn't know I needed. Permission to stay, grieve, permission to be more than a crown. You were always more than a crown, ma'am, Prince replied. Music just reminded you. Prince returned to the stage to thunderous applause. He finished the concert. But everyone knew the real performance had already happened. The moment that mattered was in the royal box. 4 minutes of a piano song that had cracked open 70 years of royal armor. The next morning, British newspapers exploded, not with criticism this time, with gratitude. Prince helps the Queen grieve. The Times, the song that made Her Majesty weep. The Times that profited. Guardian, finally, the Queen is allowed to feel. Daily Mail. The BBC footage aired repeatedly the moment Prince stopped Purple Rain. The direct address to the Queen. The tears on her face during the piano song. Britain watched their monarch cry and felt, collectively, that something important had shifted. Queen Elizabeth carried that purple handkerchief with her for the rest of her life. It was found in her personal effects, carefully preserved in tissue paper, when she died in 2022. On a small note attached in her own handwriting, from Prince, Wembley, October 1997. The Prince night I remembered. But the real impact of that October night wouldn't become clear until 2016, when Prince died and a queen said goodbye to the man who'd taught her how to grieve. The 21st of April 2016, Prince died at Paisley Park. The world mourned. Purple lights illuminated buildings from New York, London. Radio stations played his music non-stop. Fans gathered outside his compound in Minneapolis, leaving flowers and notes and purple balloons. Queen Elizabeth II, now 90 years old, released a personal statement within hours, something she rarely did for entertainers, something usually reserved for heads of state and close personal friends. Her staff was surprised by the request, but she'd been firm. This needed to be said, and it needed to be said immediately. The artist known as Prince taught a queen something invaluable in 1997. The statement read, "He showed me that strength isn't found in hiding our humanity, but in embracing it. He gave me permission to grieve when I needed it most. I will be forever grateful to have lived in the same era as such a remarkable human being. My thoughts are with his family and all who loved him." The statement surprised royal watchers worldwide. The Queen didn't usually make such personal declarations about pop stars, but those who'd been at Wembley that October night understood. This wasn't about celebrity. This was about a debt that could never be repaid. Prince's funeral at Paisley Park was attended by thousands. Among the mountains of flowers and tributes sent from around the world was a wreath from Queen Elizabeth II. It was larger than the others, purple and white roses, arranged in perfect symmetry. Attached was the purple handkerchief he'd given her 19 years earlier, carefully preserved, and a note in her own handwriting. "You taught a queen to feel. Thank you for the gift of that October night. Rest in the purple you gave us all. E.R." The handkerchief was placed near Prince's urn during the private ceremony at Paisley Park. His family, reading the Queen's note, wept. Elton John, who attended Prince's memorial service in Los Angeles, told reporters afterward, "In 1997, I watched Prince do something I'd never seen anyone do. He looked at one of the most powerful women in the world and reminded her she was human first. That's not just talent or showmanship. That's grace. That's wisdom. That's the kind of artistry that transcends music and becomes healing." Years later, when Elton was working on his autobiography and was asked about the greatest performance he'd ever witnessed, he didn't mention stadiums or award shows or legendary concerts. He mentioned that October night at Wembley. 20,000 people in the arena, Elton wrote, millions watching on television. Global broadcast. cameras everywhere. And Prince turned it all into an intimate, private conversation with one person who desperately needed to hear that it was okay to break. He saw her pain through all the protocol and pageantry. He saw her humanity through the crown. That's artistry beyond music. That's compassion on a level most of us never reach. I've been performing for 50 years, and I've never seen anything match that moment. The 8th of September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle at age 96, after 70 years on the throne, the longest reign in British history. When her personal effects were catalogued before burial, her staff found the purple handkerchief carefully stored in a private drawer in her bedroom at Windsor Castle. Still pristine, still carrying a note in her handwriting about the night she remembered how to feel. Following her explicit written instructions left years before, the handkerchief was placed in her coffin before burial. A small piece of purple fabric, carrying an enormous piece of personal history. Her children and grandchildren, seeing it placed there, finally understood the full story of that October night in 1997. The British press, covering her death and legacy, revisited the Wembley footage. That moment when Prince stopped his concert, when he sang to a grieving woman who happened to be Queen, when he gave her permission to cry. One of the defining moments of her reign wasn't a coronation or a jubilee, wrote The Guardian. It was a pop star, reminding her that queens are human too. In the months after Elizabeth's death, sales of Prince's music spiked in Britain. People revisited that 1997 performance, watched the BBC footage, and remembered the night when music transcended protocol. Royal historians later noted that after October 1997, Queen Elizabeth was more emotionally present in public, more willing to show warmth, more comfortable acknowledging difficult feelings. The Wembley moment changed her, one historian wrote. Prince didn't just give her permission to grieve Diana. He gave her permission to be fully human for the remaining 25 years of her reign. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone is give them permission to feel. Prince did that for a queen, in front of 20,000 people. He showed that compassion doesn't respect rank, grief doesn't respect protocol, and humanity is the crown we all wear. If this story reminded you that everyone, even royalty, needs permission to be human, share it with someone who's carrying weight they shouldn't have to carry alone. Comment below. When did someone give you permission to feel? Subscribe for more untold stories about the moments when music healed wounds, broke down walls, and reminded us all that we're human first, everything else second.